What's up everybody, Rob here. So, in the wake of the Bronze Age collapse, new powers emerged from the shadows of their fallen brethren. Of these new Iron Age kingdoms, the Neo-Assyrian Empire was the foremost military power and innovator in the region. Spanning from 900 BC until its destruction in 612 BC, it represented the cutting edge of military innovation throughout the ancient world. How did they do it? Let's find out. And just a quick note before we get started though, I'm going to be referring to the Assyrians as the Assyrians. Technically that is not true. These are actually the Neo-Assyrians. Likewise, the Babylonians of this era were actually the Neo-Babylonians. Both these and other empires and kingdoms actually had collapsed during the Bronze Age collapse, and the Iron Age kingdoms that took their place are rightfully denoted by historians as being Neo kingdom names. So these are the Neo-Assyrians we're going to be talking about here, and the Neo-Babylonians who they fought against, and etc., etc. However, just for the sake of the fact that I am not a professional historian and it's very clunky to say, I'm just going to be referring to them as Assyrians. Make note of that however you will. Any case, this is technically the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the Iron Age kingdom. The Assyrian Empire, or the Assyrian kingdom, is the Bronze Age precursor to it. Okay, glad we got that cleared up. All right, moving on. So warfare at this time was fought between various Mesopotamian city-states almost exclusively on a seasonal basis. Armies were almost entirely made up of part-time militia. They did have a core of permanent troops, usually household guards of the king, and the bulk of the army, however, was made up of farmers who were used in their off-season for limited campaigns against enemies of the state. This meant that the season for war was limited based on harvests and could actually vary in length based on weather conditions, climate patterns, and how fast the crops were growing. This is honestly not the best or most efficient system for an ambitious king who was bent on conquest and glory. It's very difficult to conduct a long-term campaign when at any given point the bulk of your army can just pack up and leave because they got to get the wheat in. So in spite of these limitations, however, the Assyrians did manage to conquer the largest empire in the region during the Iron Age under the reign of Ashur-Nasir-pal II, and I think I pronounced that one correctly, but in any case, under him and others. Still, it was not enough. In the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, the kingdom underwent a major overhaul. His decree was simple and at the same time extremely revolutionary, something that has never been done before throughout history. He created a professional army. Now, each region under the control of Assyria was required to provide a certain amount of soldiers for use in the king's army. While the Neo-Assyrian army was drawn from a diverse background all across the Near East and included foreigners such as Greeks and Israelites, there was also a degree of standardization that was not seen anywhere else in the ancient world. Troops would be provided by the state with matching clothing and equipment, which meant that commanders actually had an accurate view of the capabilities of individual soldiers, while also helping to integrate such diverse groups into a single functioning unit. As logistics was a key component to warfare, the Assyrian Empire was one of, if not the first empires in the Near East to build and maintain a set of roadways connecting all parts of the empire. And while they may not have been the first to create such a transportation network, none did so on such an extensive scale. This series of roads allowed rapid transport of troops and supplies quickly and efficiently across Assyrian lands. The Assyrians also utilized domesticated camels as well as wheeled wagons for transport of supplies and equipment. The Assyrians did not invent the wheel. That was invented way earlier during the Bronze Age and maybe even during the Stone Age. The Assyrians did not invent the wheel, but they were the first to coat the wheels in metal tires, first of copper and bronze and later on of iron. This made it much more durable, and honestly, a wooden wheel that's not rimmed with metal will just simply fall apart under continuous use. Metal ones will last much longer. And speaking of iron, this is in fact the Iron Age, so many of the weapons, such as spear tips, were made of iron, which was rare during this era, giving them an advantage over nations that still made use of bronze. I know the Bronze Age collapse had occurred several centuries earlier, but bronze was still at this point the primary metal of choice. The Assyrians were the first to utilize iron, which is much harder and more effective as an implement for warfare. So what did the Assyrian army look like? The core of the Neo-Assyrian army would be made up of chariots, much like its Bronze Age predecessor. Many people believe this is a holdover from the Bronze Age, but even well into the Iron Age, the Assyrians made extensive use of this weapons platform. Unlike other empires, however, the Neo-Assyrians used two separate types of chariots. The first was the light chariot, which was drawn by 2 or 3 horses. It had a crew of 2 men, a driver and an archer, and was primarily used as a mobile platform for archery. Later on, there was the introduction of the heavy chariot, a more sturdy platform drawn by up to 4 horses. Blades would be attached to the wheels of this weapon and would be used to smash into enemy formations, causing havoc among infantry. While this was an effective platform for dealing with the enemy and an utterly terrifying foe to fight against, this did have limitations, mostly in terms of terrain. It needed a broad, flat plain to operate effectively, and rough terrain would render such a weapon system useless. In addition to chariots, the Assyrians also made great use of standard cavalry, basically guys riding horses. These were often used as mounted archers, but this was an era before stirrups or even adequate saddles. To overcome these obvious limitations, the Assyrians made use of a paired system. 2 men would ride into battle, and 1 man would hold the reins of both horses, while his partner would shoot his bow into enemy formations. This system would later be replaced by lanced-armed cavalry, but would still use the 2 horsemen method, with both men helping to control the other man's mount. Cavalry has advantage over chariots in that it can operate on more rough terrain, as well as more adequately maneuver on a battlefield for flanking attacks, as well as for scouting and reconnaissance, giving the Assyrians a distinct advantage over their chariot-only enemies. The horsemen would be protected by lamellar armor made out of a series of overlapping bronze plates. The horse themselves would be equipped with padded cloth armor, which provided limited protection, but at least it was something. While the core of the army would be made up of chariots and cavalry, the bulk of forces would be made up of infantry. Like the cavalry, infantry would oftentimes operate in pairs. The first man would be a spearman, protected by a large shield, and he was responsible for providing a screen for an archer located directly behind him. These shields would be much taller than the person wielding them, providing adequate protection against incoming missile fire. The shields themselves would be made up of reeds woven together in several layers, which sounds somewhat flimsy but is actually quite sturdy if designed properly. The archers made use of composite bows made from wood and horn glued together. The bow is much more powerful than the date palm bows used in the region at the time. There is also extensive use of slingers and javelins within the Assyrian army. Infantry, given that they are much larger, were not as extensively protected as their cavalry counterparts, usually being protected by padded cloth, something very similar to a gambeson, but there are some depictions of spearmen wearing bronze scale armor, although these depictions are comparatively rare. It does seem, however, that the infantrymen would be protected by bronze caps. In other Mesopotamian and Near Eastern militaries, the armies would be organized in an ad hoc basis. In the Assyrian army, however, things would be standardized, and soldiers would be organized in groups of 10 under a single commander, which is roughly equivalent to a squad under the command of a sergeant, and 5 to 20 of these squads, so to speak, would be arranged into companies under the command of a single officer, roughly the rank of that of a captain. This is, of course, much more efficient and effective than the haphazard arrangement of other armies. So how was this all used in battle? Well, tactics of the Assyrians seem to be fairly straightforward. Chariots would storm against the enemy formation, hoping to create a breach, which would then be exploited by the cavalry and the infantry, while the archers and slingers would provide what we would today consider covering fire for these maneuvers. Cavalry would also be used for scouting and reconnaissance, and would also be utilized on the flanks to attack these vulnerable areas. Basically, send the chariots and cavalry in, create a breach, send the rest of the troops in to exploit the breach, and overwhelm them with numbers that way. That's more or less the basic Assyrian strategy. While field battles were very important to the Neo-Assyrians, they excelled most at, however, was siege warfare. Cities at the time were large, with brick and stone walls protecting them. It was difficult for a besieging force to breach into. To solve this problem, the Neo-Assyrians had a permanent standing force of combat engineers, and they specialized in breaking into enemy cities. And they were able to do this in multiple ways depending on the situation. Now, the simplest of these were siege ladders, which could also be used to cross moats and ditches around a city, and they can be used also to scale walls. They're ladders. I'm sure you guys know what a ladder is. They also made extensive use of battering rams to smash open gates and actually to create breaches within the walls of the city itself. These were covered structures which shielded the users from stones and arrows launched by the defenders of the city, and they were placed on wheels, allowing them to be rolled into position. There was also a corps of sappers who could be used to undermine the walls, basically just dig underneath them, and that would cause the walls to collapse. Or these men would also creep close to the wooden gates, starting a fire under them, destroying the gateway that way, leaving an entry for the rest of the army to pour into. The most famous, however, were the use of the Assyrian siege engines. These are large wooden towers which could overtop the walls of the city, with archers on the top of the platform picking off the defenders. Once it reached the wall, infantry could storm up and overwhelm the defenders that way. The Assyrians were also known to build earthen ramps leading up to the walls, usually at the weakest point, allowing troops to simply walk over the top of the walls or breach them much more easily. The siege of Lakish in 701 BC is a perfect example of siege warfare. Once the city was surrounded, archers and slingers kept the enemy pinned down while an earthen ramp was constructed. This ramp would then be paved with flat stones, and when completed, this provided a path for an engine, which was a combination of a tower and a ram. The lower portion of the engine was the ram, which breached the midsection of the wall, creating an opening for the attackers to pour into, while archers on top of the tower shot downward at the defenders, keeping the area clear from the enemy. Now, while all this was happening at one end of the city, infantry assaulted the other section of the city with scaling ladders. But in between this pincer, the defense would eventually collapse. Remains of this ramp are actually still seen in Tel Lakish in Israel. So what happened to a city after it was captured? Well, this is very well documented and extremely brutal. Now, like most armies of the time, the Assyrians were no strangers to ransacking a city. It actually seemed to be official policy to cause as much suffering on their enemies as possible, perhaps to cow others into submission. Punishments such as flaying of enemies alive, especially the leadership, was commonplace, as well as impalement, burning alive, mutilation, blinding, or cutting someone up and feeding them to the dogs. Now, mostly this was used against rebellious vassals. Basically, you got to keep the plebs in line. Assyrian kings were in no way hesitant to talk about this. In the words of Ashurnasirpal II, and I quote, "I felled 3,000 of their fighting men with the sword. I carried off prisoners, possessions, oxen, and cattle from them. I burnt many captives from them. I captured many troops alive. From some I cut off their arms and hands. From others I cut off their noses, ears, and extremities. I gouged out the eyes of many troops. I made one pile of living and one of heads. I hung their heads in trees around the city. I burnt their adolescent boys and girls. I razed, burnt, and consumed the city." End quote. Very charming. But yes, the Assyrians leaving pyramids of skulls and other body parts, skulls placed on stakes around the city that they had just captured. This was all basically used as a warning not to defy the might of the Assyrian king. The Assyrians would openly brag about this, and honestly, they took great pride in the amount of destruction they caused to their enemies. Now, in addition, there was also the use of deportation, which was carrying off a population from their homeland and scattering them across the rest of the areas under Assyrian control. Now, this was done for multiple reasons. First, it was to help assimilate them into the Assyrian population, where they could still be used as a labor force or conscripts in future warfare, rather than just simply killed. The process is actually described in the Old Testament, and this is the source of the lost 10 tribes of Israel who were scattered by the Assyrians after their nation was conquered. In spite of their innovations, the Assyrian Empire would eventually fall to a coalition of Persians, Medes, Scythians, Babylonians, and others, ending one of the most advanced military forces in the ancient world. In spite of this, many of their innovations, including their extensive road network, would be utilized by their conquerors, especially the Persians. That is it for this video. Just a real quick look at the Neo-Assyrian military and its innovations. Please hit the like and subscribe button. More videos coming out whenever I get around to it. Have a good day. Or don't have a good day. You're adults. Have any kind of day you want. See you later.